Hmm.
Ma'am, let's start. Are we all set?
Yeah, I think so.
Is there any noise problem or anything on your side?
No, can you hear something?
No. I'm just asking in case you can hear anything, or we can start if you're ready.
Fine.
All right. Good evening, and thank you for all of you who have joined us today. We're very grateful for the audience that we've had in the last few weeks, for writing to us, for asking us questions, and really pushing us to explore various topics and build a conversation around how the pandemic is affecting all of us. It's been a tremendous journey in the last few weeks. We've discussed various topics, starting from foreign policy.
Let's start.
Are we all set? From discussing foreign policy to desires to ecosophy. Today we have Urvashi Butalia with us. With ma'am, we will be discussing another very important topic about the differential implications of the pandemic and the lockdown on women. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to do this. We're very grateful to you. For those of you who, we don't really need to introduce you, ma'am, but for the sake of the audience, Professor Butalia is the founder of Kali for Women and Zuban. She's been a visiting faculty for the Young India Fellowship and also been associated with the Ashoka University. She's also been a very important part of the women's movement in India, and we're very excited to have you on board. With that, we'll start today's session and look forward to a very, intriguing and exciting conversation around the topic. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Amrita, and thank you, Mindsperm, for asking me to speak, and thank you for being here. So, Amrita, when you asked me to speak on this subject, I was actually wondering what I could do, because what can you say about something that everybody's talking about all the time that hasn't actually already been said? So I'm not even going to try to go there, but I think that there are a couple of things that I want to say that I will not touch on. So there's been a lot of talk about how this virus does not discriminate between the rich and the poor countries and how it impacts everyone. And there's also been a lot of talk about how it has come to India through the globe-trotting, rich, jet-setting people who have brought it along with them through their excessive plane travel and so on and so forth. So I'm going to put that aside really, but to say that although the virus may impact people or it may not decide in whose body to go and make a home, but the fact is that the pandemic has impacted people in very different and very discriminatory ways, depending on where people are placed. And among those, the most vulnerable are the ones who have been worst affected. And among those are women. So today I'm going to talk to you about the pandemic, but not necessarily the pandemic itself, because I'm neither a scientist or a virologist or an economist, and I can't go into all of those things, but I'm going to try and address the impact of that in terms of the lockdown through this human impact, through the stories of people. One of the things that strikes me about this is really both the simultaneous visibility and invisibility of women in this time of the pandemic. So if you look back at the media over the last few weeks of the lockdown, you will see that there are somewhere stories of, let's say, care workers like nurses and ASHA workers and so on. So they're not entirely out of the reckoning, but by and large, the major discourse does not really have them. So if you look at the unfortunate circumstance of the millions of laborers, informal workers who had to leave cities and go out on journeys because they had no money, no food, no job, and they were heading towards their homes and no transport either. The coverage of that was extensive in some media, but you hardly ever saw pictures of women. And it did make me wonder, why is it that we don't see women? I mean, where, the women make up a huge percentage of the informal workforce. Where would, for example, our homes be if we didn't have our domestic workers? Where would our buildings be if we did not have women construction workers? They are the ones who actually carry, as you must have noticed, all the loads up several flights of stairs to all the buildings that are being built. And in fact, a group in Rajasthan estimated, they measured the number of steps a woman construction worker walks in one day, and they came up with the result 10,000 steps. And the amount of weight she carries on her head in terms of bricks and cement adds up to 3,000 kilos. So 3,000 kilos in one day, it's not a small amount. I mean, where would our streets be if we weren't for women sanitation workers, and so on and so forth. So I did wonder at the absence, that why are we not seeing them? And really, no state proclamation, no political leader, nobody other than women activists has actually come and spoken up on behalf of women or talked about what they're doing. You have only to look at Delhi, for example, where nurses who are looking after COVID patients and who come in contact with them all the time were not given the same kind of accommodation as doctors were. They had to be 9 to a toilet. They were not even given sanitary products or anything, and nobody really listened to them until their union came up and actually made some demands, and only then were they actually paid attention to. On the 4th of April, when it was still quite early in terms of getting an idea of the impact of this disease, a number of women's groups wrote to the Chief Minister of Delhi, alerting him to the special vulnerabilities of women and the things that he needed to pay attention to. So far, they have received no reply, but a minuscule number of their suggestions have been taken up. We don't know if this is because of them having raised this or for some other reason, but they haven't given up the pressure. Now, some 10 days ago, I spoke in a webinar on women and the pandemic, and much of what I said holds true even today. And I'd like to just reiterate some of the things before I go on. When I spoke earlier, I pointed out that What we knew about, I pointed to some of the things that we knew about how women were impacted by the lockdown. The first thing that was very evident and that has been talked about recently and that came about in women's lives was how women were differentially impacted across caste and class. Many elite working women, for example, found themselves trapped inside homes with husbands or partners and often other family members, and found the burden of work on them, particularly unpaid care work, had increased. Despite having a job, once in the home, they were asked to take care of all the additional work and perform domestic tasks. For women who were not previously working women outside the home but were homemakers, earlier they at least had some part of the day to themselves once their husbands went out to work. But now, with everybody inside the home at the same time, a lot of tensions came up. Many women face domestic violence. Also, other things had begun to come to the attention. And one of those is that the pandemic brought out the worst in people, as we know from the attacks that have happened on Muslim vegetable sellers and others. And there is a lot of discussion now inside families about who deserves to live and who doesn't. In such situations, biases against the most vulnerable inside families, those often happen to be widows or disabled persons or young women, are strengthened and can be very dangerous for them. Then levels of domestic violence rose for all women. For poor women trapped inside cramped homes, the situation was much worse. Domestic violence has been flagged by many countries. But in India, the impact is also more serious because women, especially poor women, have no real way of reporting this violence. Who will they report it to, for one thing, because all services surrounding the reporting of domestic violence, such as helplines, etc., have been suspended in the face of the medical emergency. And only NGOs have been keeping them running, but also women caught inside homes don't have the privacy to be able to find a moment to call up somebody, and nor do they have a lot of cell phones. Recently, things have begun to change a bit with the National Commission of Women stepping in and activating many different centers across the country. And now the number of calls has started to increase. So the National Commission, for example, now says that they have received over 1 lakh of complaints about domestic violence. Um, when you had put out the announcement for this webinar, a number of questions came in. And here, I just want to take one of the questions that had come in, which is that how to deal with domestic violence. Because if women do complain, what happens? Because transport is suspended, because there is no way in which help workers, social workers, even if they were available, can reach them, all that can be done is counseling on the phone. This question here says, can community groups like self-help groups and others on the ground help to deal with this? In theory, yes, but in practice, they can't because community groups are not able to meet at the moment. And that is also one of the biggest losses, because even if women don't have access to a network to actually make a formal complaint, the community can sometimes at least provide an ear, provide a hearing, and that too has now gone. Um, so violence is only one issue. Another issue that I flagged in that webinar was women's reproductive rights. So for example, the reproductive rights and sexual health services have not been declared essential services. Now that outpatient departments of most hospitals are closed, women do not know where to go to even receive the most minimum of healthcare, such as postnatal, antenatal, natal services, or anything like that. And even something that is a human right, that is a right that women have, such as the right to abortion, which they got in 1971, is no longer now available to them. So there is a suspension of women's rights as well. There were other issues as well. For women caught in homes without toilets, where were they to go? And the open field was no longer an option. How would women get rid of sanitary waste with waste management systems having collapsed? In previous times, they would throw them in ponds and dustbins and other places. Now they couldn't. So if you couldn't step outside the house, how could you actually do this? A few days ago, I was listening to a gynecologist speak about her practice, and she said that she had to close her OPD at the hospital where she works, and was therefore unable to provide her patients the much needed care that they needed. Last week, a women's group called Sama filed a petition in the courts that women who were about to give birth be provided ambulances to get them to hospital during the lockdown. This was based on a real life incident of a pregnant, full-term pregnant woman who had to run from pillar to post, trying to get a hospital to admit her so that she could give birth. So maternal mortality is already quite high in our country. Imagine if women are unable to find hospitals to do this most normal of things, which is to give birth. There are also women in the informal labor force, such as ASHA workers, A&M nurses, Anganwadi workers, who are already overworked, underpaid, exploited, and not given protective equipment, and their lives too were at risk. Many of these women are single parents, others are women-headed households. All their lives become much more vulnerable. Today, for example, panchayats have called upon ASHA workers and Anganwadi workers to carry out surveys on COVID, to provide food to children, the midday meal, and to do a general watching out for possible suspected cases. Now, women have to do this all day. On top of this, they have to find time to run their own homes, to go and fetch water, and so on and so forth. So there was a question here also about delivering sanitary towels, that is the government delivering free sanitary towels, etc. The ASHA workers are now delivering sanitary towels, but what this means for them, so we have to think of them as well, is that they have to go house to house to deliver these. And there's no transport. So they are particularly vulnerable and they have to walk and so on. But at the government, for example, when it was delivering relief packages to families, they thought of atta and dal and so on and so forth, but they never thought of sanitary towels until women's groups started to push them. And now that is beginning to change. The other two subjects that I addressed at that time were the supply chain for contraceptive services and contraceptives that has completely collapsed with industries shutting down and with the non-availability of contraceptives, both to men and women, in a moment when sexual contact is very high because men and women are inside homes together and with no other kind of distractions, unprotected sex can actually lead to very, very serious consequences. I also spoke in that webinar of the importance of looking at the language critically, language that is being used to describe this pandemic because it's full of misogyny. So things like Lakshman Rekha and all of that, and I'm not going to go into that. There was a question here that can we make the government supply the Saheli, the Indian contraceptive pill and pads, etc., etc. So, you know, the thing is that making the government do anything is an impossibility for us. One can suggest it, recommend it, ask for it. But actually, I don't know about the availability of the pill because all that is there is the existing stocks. And new manufacturers, as I just mentioned, are not taking place. So I'm not sure how they will be able to supply them. So all these things hold true today. These have been talked about not really by our governments, but by international bodies across the world, and they are drawing attention to these. So now I began by talking about the differential impact on COVID. And it is true that women of COVID on women, it's true that women across the board have suffered. Their burdens of work have increased. They've had to do more unpaid care work, look after children, etc., etc. If you are a middle-class woman living in a city, your difficulties are of a different order than those of poor women. You have some space at home. You may have a laptop, you may have television. Poor women have none of these. So when poverty and gender intersect, the vulnerability of women is heightened. When you then overlay this with caste, you get an even deeper vulnerability. So you take the example of sanitation workers who often embody these three things together, and large numbers of them are women, they're poor, they're low caste, and they are supposedly in, within quotes, a dirty profession, which is what keeps, ironically, which is what keeps our lives clean. Many of these women are daily wagers, and they have nothing at a time like this. They can't work from home. They have no job security. They have to come out onto the streets to sweep and swab and clean and collect garbage. And they have no masks even. So basically they cover their faces with their dupattas to protect themselves. So for them, the idea of stay home, stay safe is incomprehensible. Further, because their employment is insecure, when it comes to the distribution of relief and so on, many of them get left out because they don't have the documentation needed to do this. There is also this very strange thing that if women and if men as well migrate to the city to work, their ration cards are often listed in the place where they live. And although ration cards in theory are supposed to have a mobility, in actual fact, it does not happen. So if they are in the city, they cannot even claim the ration that might be due to them on their ration card. Now, there was a question here, which I also want to address, which had come in, which is about whether manuals, the fact of understanding the vulnerability of sanitation workers will make manual scavenging go away from our society. I actually don't think it's going to be that easy because manual scavenging is illegal by law and it hasn't gone away for so many years because our society is so deeply casteist that I don't think it's going to be easy for it to go away. Another, I think, very important thing is how we are looking at our migrant workers. They are now being projected everywhere as helpless and starving. And although this is the truth of their lives, they are helpless, they are starving. But what we are doing and continuing to represent them in this way is also that we are kind of taking away their dignity. You know, in all the pictures of the poor men begging for food and poor people begging for food and so on. And I think this is really terrible. And this is the equivalent of domestic workers not being allowed to come into posh colonies by employers who are reluctant to pay their wages. One of the things I find very difficult to understand about our middle classes, they will enthusiastically demonstrate themselves as loyal citizens and respond to appeals to go out and beat thalis when the prime minister says that to them. But the prime minister is also saying other stuff which they don't give a damn about. They don't care to listen to. So he has several times said, do not stop paying people their wages. But this our middle classes do not listen to. So they've stopped paying wages to anyone. And I have an example of this from my own life, which happened just today, and which isn't to do with a domestic worker, but which is to do with a young woman who works as a yoga teacher. And she comes from a sort of lower middle class family. Her husband runs 2 taxis, and the income that she earns from doing a couple of yoga classes is very, very important to her. But because of the lockdown, she hasn't been able to take classes for a while. And then suddenly one day she thought, why don't I do them online? And she got in touch with us and said, would we like to have online classes? And all of us jumped at the idea. So she's been doing them. I recently paid her what we pay her for 2 months. And 3 of the 7 people in my class came back to me and said, why did you do that? It is not fair, because she only did a certain number of classes and not the full lot of classes. But she couldn't have done the full lot because we were all in lockdown. And none of us thought of going online. She did. So I don't really understand where this comes from. Let me move on now. We know that about 94% of our workers in the unorganized sector are in the unorganized sector, and large numbers of these are women who are concentrated in some key sectors: construction, sanitation, farming, care work, anganwadis, and some marketing and selling. They are extremely vulnerable. Their existences are fragile. They are paid much less than their male counterparts. They have no contracts. They are not even given the status of workers. If you look at construction as an example, men do masonry, they do carpentry, etc. It's women who carry the bricks and the cement, and that is not casual work. What's happening to these women at this time? So every day I see that the newspapers and television channels are full of stories of corona warriors, for example, delivery boys who bring goods to our home, others who are battling terrible conditions to survive, painters who painted a school in return for the school giving them place to stay. And all this is great. They're really important. But why is it that we don't hear stories of ASHA workers, of nurses, of sanitation workers? So ASHA and Anganwadi workers deliver midday meals to families in small towns and villages. Often they work several miles. I heard in a webinar a couple of weeks back that in Rayalaseema district, in Anantapur in Rayalaseema district, roughly 75% of the farmers are women. This year, they've had a good crop of groundnuts, of bananas, of oranges, but they're unable to do anything because the markets are closed. But we don't get to read about these stories. And I think it's really important that we know them because visibility is really necessary. If we don't see women, we will forget that they exist. I think that any empathetic society needs to be deeply aware of the dignity of these workers who also contribute hugely to the GDP. And yet we're treating them like they don't belong to our society and actively taking away their dignity and pride. I was thinking about this and I was struck by one thing. This business of domestic workers who are not paid because they are not performing their duties. Last year in Delhi, the pollution levels rose really high. They were beyond the danger mark. A large number of schools and universities were closed down because of this. But parents did not stop paying fees, and schools did not stop paying teachers' salaries. But we are very quick to cut the pay of our poorer people and basically turn them into beggars. I think this moral responsibility rests squarely on our shoulders. This morning, there was a news item in the papers that said that the 1,000 rupee grant that the union government had given to poor women through their Jan Dhan Yojana in 2 installments of 500 each was now ready to pay its second installment. So this is good news because even though that money is hardly anything, it's important, and anything is better than nothing. But actually the difficulty is that for women to be able to access this money, they have to go to the bank. Banks are sometimes quite far from women's homes, and sometimes they might end up walking 2 or 3 hours to the bank and get there and the money has run out, and then they have to come all the way back. And of course, if you're disabled or vulnerable, then it's even more difficult to do this. So those are things also that we need to take into account. Yesterday, I was listening to Nidhi Goyal, who's a disability rights campaigner, and she pointed out how the disabled community, for example, were coping with this challenge. And she was talking about visually challenged people. And she said how meaningless the whole business of social distancing, physical distancing is to them, and how meaningless it is to be told that be careful of touching surfaces because that is how the infection spreads. And she said that for those of us who are visually challenged, touch is the first thing that we have, and it is touch that allows us to negotiate our lives. We can walk out onto the street and somebody will hold our hand and take us somewhere. And all of that is impossible. So how do people negotiate their lives today? Similarly, if you go further down the chain of vulnerabilities, you will see other truths. So we've all seen how hijras and trans people have a very public life, begging at traffic lights or going house to house and giving blessings in return for money. And it's a very interesting thing that society really looks down on them as if they are in some ways dirty, unclean, frightening, all of that kind of thing, although we are quite willing to receive their blessings when they give them to us. But people like these, and trans women in particular also, are finding that their access to a livelihood is completely wiped out because their lives are lived in the public domain, and that domain no longer exists. India has one of the lowest workforce participation rates for women in the world, and that has fallen a lot in recent years. People are still speculating about what the reason for this could be, but what is undeniable is that large numbers of women are out of work. There are still some professions, though, in recent times that have actually employed quite a few women and offered some opportunities to women. And these are professions like hotels, airlines, restaurants, and so on. Now, all of those things are closed and women are out of jobs. When they go back or when these things restart, there is no doubt that there will be fewer jobs. People are already talking about how they will travel less and so on and so forth. And the chances are that because so many employers think women are trouble within quotes because they ask for all sorts of concessions, I use that word within quotes, that they will not employ that many women. So the situation, women will get pushed back into the home and into joblessness, which is not a good thing to be. For informal workers, the situation is even worse. I mean, for example, there are numbers of families, women and children who work inside homes and who do piecework, which becomes part of a larger whole. Or in their spare time, they will do things like make bidis and so on and so forth. Now, with houses being deeply crowded, this has also disappeared. So I don't know what's going to happen here as well. The lack of alcohol is also impacting women's lives in very strange ways and very different ways. For example, men who are unable to access alcohol are desperate, and sometimes this leads to a lot of violence, or they drink all kinds of homemade liquors, which are very dangerous for health. In Haryana, I'm told that it's the opposite, that lots of young men have bought up lots of cartons of liquor and they've now turned their homes into places from where they can either sell or where people can come together to drink. So there are many other things to talk about, but I think I'll try to wind up now. I'd like to do this by telling you a story. And this is a story collected by a group called Swati. The words, Swati in Ahmedabad, the word stands for Society for Women's Action and Training Initiatives. It's a story of a single mother, Jyoti, who is a survivor of violence and who recently managed to get a divorce from her abusive husband and has then filed a maintenance claim through the Mahila Sahitya Kendra in her area. Luckily, she got a job as a cleaner in the court after this, and she was able to earn like 200 rupees a day, 25% of which went in her travel, but the rest she had to look after her young son. When the COVID crisis came, she was rendered jobless because the courts have closed down, and obviously her job was a daily wage job. She was offered relief and rations by a local NGO, but her husband's brother created havoc, saying that she did not need this help since her husband was still alive to provide for her. Now, Jyoti's ration card and all her papers are still with her husband, which means she cannot even use them to buy grain at the PDS shop. Her case for maintenance is pending and will not come up very soon because the courts are not functioning. So what will she do? And Jyoti could be one of the workers who is working in one of our houses as well. And her entire life has been badly impacted by this crisis. So a question that always arises when you're trying to wrap up a discussion like this is, what can we do? Is there anything we can do? Well, I think there is a fair amount that we can do. First, I think that there is enough knowledge that we have now from over the years, from having dealt with many different kinds of disasters that have taken place in our society, both disasters that we call man-made, where I use the word within quotes, or natural, again, using the word within quotes. And we know from things like the tsunami and the Latur earthquake and so on, that women and vulnerable communities are impacted differently. We need to learn from that. We need to learn from that and to have some plans in place to address the most vulnerable people in our society. It's not rocket science. We need a plan, we need a budget. Other countries have done it, Canada and France, to name only two. It doesn't matter if a disaster overtakes us by surprise, although for this we were somewhat prepared, but you can still have the makings of a plan that you can adapt and put in place shortly after. We could have done that with the women in this country easily, but we haven't. What action we have taken has just happened in response to pressure from women's groups. Then I think we need to be careful that the situation does not lead to what seems to be happening here, an erosion of that which is most precious for people, their citizenship rights. So by taking away effectively abortion facilities, which is a right you have, that right is being eroded. By taking away or by not making it possible for women to report domestic violence under the Domestic Violence Act of 2005, which allows for the abuser to be taken away from the victim or survivor who is being abused, you are violating that right, women's citizenship rights. Why should these rights be suspended in a medical emergency, in a time of a medical emergency? Every single one of our leaders, our politicians, our leaders, no matter which party they belong to, who sit in seats of power, come from families that have daughters, mothers, sisters, wives, and other women in them. They all, for example, know what menstruation is. Why did they not think of it? Why did they not think that when they were handing out relief packages, rations, atta dal, that they could include sanitary towels in them? Okay. When they could think of food and petrol and medicines as essential items, why didn't they think of sanitary towels and sexual, and say, for example, condoms and other things as essential items? Then I think it's not enough to blame the state, because we always do that, but also to ask ourselves, how many of us, when we saw relief being distributed, went up and said, what about sanitary towels and other things? We didn't do that. How many of us, middle class people, demanded from our RWAs that they allow domestic servants, or they insist that employers pay domestic servants their full salary for these months while we are under lockdown? We haven't done any of these things. I think in some ways this moment provides us with an opportunity to actually ask ourselves, to hold up a mirror to ourselves and to ask ourselves what we can do and how we can take a responsible position vis-a-vis the most vulnerable, the poorest in our society, and how we can do this as responsible citizens. So I think that it's time that we turn to this. And, women's groups have been doing this. For example, I told you they filed a case, they wrote a letter. Now other groups are pressing for abortion services to be made available as essential services. So they're not letting up the pressure. But I think it has to be the broader citizenry also who does this. Okay, so it would be a pity to waste this opportunity. There is a question here which I've added on, and I want to just look at it and respond to it. The question is about health and nutrition standards for women, which they say has always been lower than that of men. What can we do as a society to build stronger immunity among mothers who bring a healthier generation? And what can why does the making of food still remain a responsibility for women, even with taboos like menstruation? I think actually this crisis has also shown us the inadequacy of our health services and the inadequacy of our health budget, which does not prioritize the health of the people and which has in recent years been declining. I think as a people, now we know very well, and one of the things we need to fight for is that health should be as much of a priority, if not more. In fact, it should be more of a priority than, say, defense, So, and what can we do to ensure that the making of food doesn't remain the responsibility of women only? I think this is a much longer thing. This is something that this crisis is not going to give us an answer to, but that it can help to take the first step towards changing, because it is true that despite all the terrible things that are happening with women, in some households, men are actually beginning to understand, and young children are, especially male children, are beginning to understand what a lot of work it is to keep a household together. And they are beginning to contribute to the work and perhaps change their mindset a bit. So this moment will give us some of that change in a very limited way, but it will not be transformatory in a radical way. For that, we need much more, and for a much longer time. We have been fighting for this for I don't know how long, but eventually that change will have to come, and it'll come from many things, from education, from activism, from law, and not only necessarily from a pandemic. And finally, I want to address one other question that one of you raised, which is that how will COVID-19 encourage rural India to forego religious beliefs and build toilets at home? See, I think this is a very interesting question. I mean, I would put a question back to this questioner saying, is it religious beliefs that prevent the building of toilets at home? And I think in some ways also another question, that why do we think that the religious beliefs of rural people are the ones only that we need to see as stopping people from doing something or the other? You saw that people's religious beliefs, you saw a demonstration of people's religious beliefs when they came out to beat those thalis and so on, and when they were convinced that the noise would chase away the virus and the vibrations that were built would somehow do away with the illness that was upon us. So I think the religious beliefs in themselves are not the issue, but obscurantist religious beliefs are, and those are not the preserve of people in rural areas only. Those are also very prevalent in our very wealthy and very well educated middle class neighborhoods. And I think if we are to address those, we need to address those everywhere, and not to think that the problem lies in the rural areas. That becomes very easy for us in some ways to say that, because then we can absolve ourselves of the responsibility. And if one thing this pandemic has shown us is that the responsibility really rests also very much on us to make the changes that we can see around us that need to be made. So I'm going to stop over here, and if there are other questions, then we can talk about them and see.
Thank you, ma'am. That was truly insightful for us to really understand how the lockdown situation, especially, has affected women. Um, you have touched upon various points in the last 30 minutes. We still, however, have a couple of questions from our audience with respect to the lockdown, especially, and how it really affects women in the workforce. Whether the workforce here being domestic work or employment in terms of corporations, schools, etc. So anecdotally, it's very evident to us that in a family setting, the men come first and children come next, and the women are always left to fend for themselves while taking care of the rest of the family. So in a situation like that, and usually in cases of domestic abuse and the likes, there are state mandated groups like the Women's Commission that take care of these situations. However, in states like Telangana and Uttarakhand, the Women's Commission is known to be non-functional and absent. So in a situation like this, especially during a pandemic, what would be, or rather, what can women do if not rely on just if not just rely on women's groups to really bring their issues up front?
See, I don't think the onus should be on women. I mean, to say what can women do, I'm guessing that the person who asked that question doesn't mean that it's the responsibilities on women, but what are the options available to women? They are not that many, unfortunately, although since the national, and you're right to say that the state commissions, many of them are not that active, but the National Commission has been reasonably active, and they have contacted a number of state commissions, and they have set up helplines which women can access. But helplines are not the only thing, you know. In many ways, there are other things that we can learn from in many other countries. So I believe, for example, in France, this is hearsay, but in supermarkets or shops, they have places where women can go and speak out their complaints or leave their names, and then some services will be accessed and people can go to them. So for us, I think what this government needs to do is to, you know, think again about the suspension of certain services in order to focus on COVID. Of course, it's important to focus on COVID. Nobody is saying that you can't focus on it, but you should not suspend the services that actually are very key services in society, and response to domestic violence is one of them. Right now, it's difficult because nobody's coming there. So women also are not, you know, they know that all they can get is counseling at the end of a phone call, but no social worker is able to come to them or anything like that. And those services are the ones that actually importantly need to be retained and reinstated. Okay, they may, it could be that in, you know, if you have a shortage of police force, etc., they may be reduced, but you can't wipe them out. You can't, you can't throw society into a suspension as if everything else stops. Giving birth, abortion, I mean, how can you not have abortion services? The lockdown is already 49 days or how many days? And what is the danger period for an abortion? And what will women do after that? And this is a right. So how can you not have this? So these things are important to put in place. So there have to be a plan. That's what I was saying. The state has to have a plan.
Thank you, ma'am. We do have another question with respect to the new phenomenon of working from home. Again, this phenomenon also has a very differential impact on both men and women. So, with that, there have been fears about how women are going to be more redundant in the workforce, or how their jobs would be more or less effective than men. So, what are your thoughts on a situation like that, especially with organizations reducing their workforce?
Yeah, I think that is a real danger. See, across the world, we know from history that first, the entry of women into the workforce in pretty much everywhere was not an easy entry, in the sense that men did not welcome them because, of course, they felt their jobs were threatened and so on and so forth. But women entered the workforce because certain kinds of industries, certain kinds of histories created that need for them. Okay. So the entry has always been, in some ways, once they have entered it, they've had to fight for that space to retain it. And in the minds of so many employers, there is always a hostility towards the worker because they always see the worker in oppositional terms. So even male workers are seen in oppositional terms. That's why such a resistance to forming unions or allowing unions to be formed. That's why industry has made a demand that there should be no unions in this period and so on. But women workers are therefore seen as even more troublesome because they want maternity leave, and maternity leave is seen as if it's a concession or a privilege that women are asking for. So for once there is a situation in which women are out of the workforce, their re-entry in a situation where employment is reduced anyway becomes much more difficult. So women will be much more vulnerable. And we have already seen that many corporates are saying that they will cut down on the numbers of job offers they have made. And the chances are, we can only speculate, but the chances are that they will cut down a lot on the numbers of women.
Um, in addition to the question, there, with the kind of perceived gender roles that we have in society, there is also a conversation going around how the work from home situation would in fact benefit women and give them an opportunity to join the workforce more than ever before. So, what are your thoughts on that part of the same equation?
I mean, benefit women. I'm not sure in what way. Does the questioner have any detail on that?
Sure, I can read out the question, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this lockdown crisis is going to prepare a case for work from home for the service sector jobs. Companies have made announcements recently claiming that it will be beneficial, especially for working women.
Hmm.
So, what is your take on the situation?
Okay, so I think it's likely to be, it can be, and it can't be. I mean, in a sense, it's a mixed kind of thing. It may actually be quite beneficial for women in the sense that they will be able to work in their own time. They will save time on travel. They will not be subjected to the kind of sexual harassment that they might be subjected to when they're in an office space with guys and so on. But at the same time, the danger is that the boundaries collapse between the home and the workplace. The impact is felt largely by women. You know, the domestic work will, which they already bear the burden of, is not going to go away, and it might get more, and it might become difficult for them to be able to keep those things clear. Of course, this is a never, you can never take a decision on this in black and white, because for some women, they may find it wonderful to work at home. But for others also who may be caught, for example, in an oppressive home situation, getting out is really important. And I think if you go beyond the individual thing, yes, I think companies will save money, et cetera, by having women work from home. But the importance of women getting out into the public space cannot be, I mean, it needs to be really underlined. Because the more women you see in the public space, the more normal it seems. The more normal women's presence seems in the public space, the more the character of that public space will change. And this is what, when Arvind Kejriwal tried to make metro rides free for women, this is what the thinking behind it was. I mean, I'm guessing as an outsider that you could have many more women in the public space. And women have fought so hard to get what little access they have to the public space. If they are now pushed back into their homes by corporate policies, I think they also run the risk of losing many of those gains.
While we're on the topic of public and private spaces, we also have another question, which where the person really wants to know how the family dynamics will be affected, and moreover, how the privacy of women will really take a hit, or what actually would happen to a situation like that during a lockdown phase.
So I think we've already spoken a little bit about family dynamics, and I think again that varies. See, if you are in a middle class home with several rooms, etc., you can have the option of going away somewhere, and maybe if you can find the time, you can move out of what might be an oppressive space to another space. But if you are caught in a small space with lots of people there, then there is no escape. And so you could say that pre-lockdown and pre the closure of many work activities, what would an ordinary household in, let's say, a village look like, where the husband is a farmer and the woman helps on the farm, but she's a homemaker? So he would go early in the morning, she would be doing all the chores, cooking everything, and then she would take the food to him in the fields and work with him a little bit and come back. She had those moments in between where she was on her own, where she could perhaps go to the self help group or meet with others in the village. And those were very precious moments for her. And those moments are lost at this time. So she loses some of that. If the husband is an oppressive, violent husband, then there is no getting away from that violence. But if you have a husband, families, partners who are who see and appreciate the work you're doing and who are keen to contribute to it, then there is a different kind of transformation. And I think that those family spaces will be transformed in many different ways. I don't think we can generalize. And the transformations will be different across class and across caste. In Dalit households, for example, men and women go out to work. And men and women also work inside the home. I think the transformations there will be very different from, say, the transformations in your house or my house.
We do have another question, ma'am. So it goes like this. When we thought that boundaries in gender roles are diluting due to the lockdown, um, the kind of comments around surrounding the same only re-establish the masculine gendered narrative. So what would your thought on that be?
Sorry, read that first part again. When
Uh, Sorry. Uh, so we're regularly seeing comments like when men are wearing aprons and are finally reaching their potential and
oh,
are
okay.
support to women, etc. So
Hmm.
by speaking about men taking over the domestic space, it is in a way a very masculine and gendered narrative about things, about them supporting women or about them taking over the space. So what is your thoughts? What are your thoughts on these boundaries in gender roles?
I don't think men will ever take over that space unless they are already in it and they have already wanted to do it. I mean, I know several men who are homemakers and their wives work. There's no question of taking over the space. That space is theirs, and there is an agreement between them of who occupies which space, and they share the space as well. But will men take over the domestic space? I don't think so. You know, we have, I mean, if you simply look at it as the activity of cooking, we've enough evidence before us to see that men actually are quite like cooking and they're happy to cook, but they like cooking when it's remunerative by and large. And for their cooking abilities, they get money, right? Women don't. So I don't know for whether they will actually enter or take over that space. But these things about men wearing the apron, and you see advertisements with men, pressing the button on the washing machine, big deal. But sure, all of these things are good and add to the transitions or transformations. When they will happen, they normalize something which otherwise seems extraordinary, but they are too few and far between. And I don't know how seriously they're done. I haven't seen any of these with guys wearing aprons, but I shall keep a lookout for them.
Great. Thank you so much, ma'am. Do you have any closing thoughts on the conversation today or in general?
Um, no, I don't. I don't think so. But so I'm glad to hear the questions. And this is the first time I've done something live on YouTube, so it's quite a different experience from sort of having people around you that you can talk to. So it's been interesting. Thank you for asking me to do this, and good luck with all the other ones that you're doing.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It has indeed been an honor to have you on the lecture series, and it's all, as always, it's been great in terms of building a new narrative and also engaging with the narratives that exist already. Um, Before we close, I do have a couple of announcements that I'd like to make with respect to the lecture series itself. So we've had 3 tremendous weeks with multiple speakers who really helped us begin conversations and also be a part of the conversations around us. Um, so right now, what we ask of our viewers and all the entire audience is that you write to us with your suggestions, write to us with topics and speakers that you would like us to have on the platform, because we really do want to expand on the topics and speakers, and also have everybody share their input as to who they'd like to see and who they'd like to interact with. The second thing is also that we're very excited to say that starting next week, we're also going to be having live performances with artists. We partnered with the 30th July Project, which is an artist management nonprofit started by Young India Fellows of the batch of 2020. So stay tuned to our Instagram and YouTube, and you will get more details about the collaboration and what you can see in the coming weeks. You can find the link to send us your suggestions and thoughts on YouTube Live and also on our Instagram page. With that, I'd like to close today's session. Thank you, ma'am, again for being a part of this. It's been an absolute honor. And that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I'm Amrita, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, Amrita. Bye.